Can anybody hear me?
I think the combination
Yeah,
of mental health issues and the opioid.
I appreciate your insight. Let's get this show on the road. Let's get some licenses in people's hands.
Slapping?
Yeah. You hats.
Or no,
I wear
okay, great.
Well. Yeah, I'm good. Okay.
Okay, did we begin?
Yeah.
Okay. Can you confirm that we have a quorum?
We do have quorum.
Great, thank you. So good evening, everyone. This is the State Licenses and Permits Committee of Community Board 5. I'm Janice Young, your committee chair, and we'll go around the room to introduce ourselves, starting with my vice chair.
Miles Kerwin.
Sachi Takahashi-Rao.
Hi, I'm Milan Miakovich.
Yoden Fondon.
Christopher Natoya. David Shapiro.
Great, thank you. And before I begin with the agenda, I want to welcome the two new members to our committee, Milan and Tom Ricardo, who is not, just walked in.
Oh, no. Sorry, I got a little bit first time here. Just
Okay.
got announced.
Yeah, we're live. Anyway, we have two items on the agenda tonight. The first of which.
You've got, are you online?
Oh, sorry, I always forget about. Todd,
Okay,
please go ahead.
Todd Shapiro, longtime SLAP member.
And Catherine Ellington.
Thank you, Todd and Catherine. Okay, so we have two items on the agenda tonight. The first of which is to discuss and vote on an assessment criteria for future dining out applications. And then the second is an update from the RLA task force. Is there anyone attending that has any other business for the committee other than the items on the agenda? If so, please raise your hand in person or virtually using the raise hand button. Second. Okay, so Steve Wagoda, we will promote you to panelist.
Hello,
Hi.
can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I am an architect. I have filed for 130 sidewalk cafes in New York. And I don't know if it is okay for me to talk about the current regulations versus what could be modified and why. And that's what I like to talk about.
Great. So this is an item on our agenda tonight. So we'll have you speak then, if that's okay.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you. Okay. Okay. Anyone else? New business? Okay. Seeing none, new business is closed, and we'll now move on to our agenda items. So we are not hearing any applications tonight, but I'd still like to follow our usual process of having a topic presented, in this case by myself, and then having members of the committee ask questions by raising their hand and waiting to be recognized. After that, I'll give the public the opportunity to comment, again, by using the raise hand button. Once they are recognized, we'll ask them to turn on the camera, unmute themselves, state who they are and their relevance to the topic, and give their comment. After that, I'll put the committee into business session, during which only the committee will discuss the application. At that point, no further input from the public is appropriate unless requested by the chair. And then during business session, the committee will discuss the agenda item, and if necessary, there will be a motion and the committee will take a vote. The vote of this committee will be our recommendation to the full board of CV5, which will meet on Thursday, November 14th. Please check our website for more information. And the vote of the full board will be CB5's position on that item. So with that, we will move on to the first item, which is to discuss and vote on assessment criteria for future dining out application. Okay, so picking up from where we left off on September 4th, when the committee reviewed our new evaluation form for dining out applications and how it evolved from the work of the Open Restaurants Task Force that was approved in June 2022. In order for the board to continue the work we started, where we issued recommendations for applications to meet the deadline set by DOT without waiting for committee or full board approval, today we must review and vote on the process by which specific recommendations will be issued. So as mentioned at our September meeting, we've been trying to be as thorough as possible with our due diligence and feedback, noticing the public for comment and reaching out to the applicant to review their application with them and conduct a site visit as we do with liquor licenses. If we receive significant community feedback, we will then try to resolve issues in a community meeting or a committee, depending on what the application deadline allows. So I had sent around, or Maz had sent around the document, which clarified how that matrix that the Open Restaurants Task Force had created a couple of years ago evolved into a new evaluation form that we were using to assess these different locations. I will bring it up on the screen for a quick review in case people haven't had a chance to look at it, and for anyone in attendance who hasn't seen it. Just give me 1 second. Sure. Okay, so this is a document that was shared again at our September meeting. There's been a few revisions since then, but generally it's the same, where we came up with an evaluation form with different response anchors. So essentially, we would ask committee members to review the site and indicate on a scale from 1 to 5, 1 being worst or least desirable, 5 being more desirable, what they felt the site was, how the site looked. So the first section had to do with the effect of the proposed setup on the shared use of the sidewalk and street. The least desirable outcome would be where the footprint blocks or interferes with use of the sidewalk by, for other purposes. If we felt that it got in the way of pedestrians or vehicles or bicycles, or somehow obstructed the light and air of the area, that would be the worst case scenario. The best case scenario is where, the footprint is reasonable given the sidewalk that it's on or the roadway that it's on, and still allows for other uses of the public space. And this was a summation of some of the matrix points, which are listed out below. So that, for example, the Open Restaurants Task Force had concerns about sidewalk accessibility and street accessibility, public safety impact, which there are questions about how thoroughly DOT reviews that before sending it to us. But that essentially exists. The way this was summarized is to follow the form that DOT gives us to provide feedback. So the first section was physical footprint and dimensions. The second section was pedestrian flow. The third section had to do with existing curb use. We also care about method of operation. So in regard to hours, the service is going to be primarily standing or seated, what the history of sanitation is. And then the last piece of it is any community input. So based on the comments that we get, characterizing, first of all, whether or not we get comments, and then characterizing those comments for review. So ultimately, these response anchors form this evaluation form here. Yes, which you can see. So again, least desirable would be where the footprint blocks equitable use of the sidewalk or street. more desirable is that it leaves ample room. We have space for comments to elaborate on the area. In regard to pedestrian flow, we have points on pedestrian safety. So where we feel that the cafe would inhibit visibility for a pedestrian or their ability to navigate the sidewalk or street safely versus the cafe having little to no effect on that. The risk of crowding, where because of the large footprint or just how they've arranged their tables and seatings or any sort of past history of the operation, where we feel that there could be high risk of crowding in this new cafe, or the opposite, where there's low potential because, you know, it's not that big or everyone's going to be seated, there's not that many tables, and in the past, they've not had any issues. Overall impact, where the addition of the cafe in context with all the other cafes on the street could be an issue versus, you know, maybe it's the only cafe on the block and will not be an issue. We try to note the number of outdoor cafes on the block currently, excluding the applicant. And then in regard to existing curb use, we look out for potential for conflicts with planters, bike racks, bike lanes, bus stops, etc., and determine if it is likely or is not likely to cause congestion as a result of all these objects. And then regarding the method of operation, we do want to know if the cafe is already licensed or if they intend to apply for a license or they have no intention of serving liquor. As mentioned at the September meeting, any establishment that wishes to serve liquor in their outdoor space, regardless of what their current status is or current approvals are, they will have to go through an alteration application in order to have this roadway or sidewalk cafe licensed. But just for our purposes, just so we can work with the applicant to give them a heads up about what our expectations are regarding liquor. The hours of operation, DOT's hours of operation are 8 a.m. to midnight, Monday through Saturday, 10 a.m. to midnight Sunday. For us, for any establishment that's serving liquor, our policy for rooftop and rear yard spaces generally state that the hours are no later than 10 p.m. Sunday through Thursday and 11 p.m. Friday to Saturday. And, you know, that's a guideline. There are factors that go into that decision as to whether later hours could be allowed, but it's something that we are keeping track of. Regarding music and noise, DOT's policy is that no amplified sound is authorized in these spaces. So making sure that the applicant is aware of that. Again, we want to know the service style, if it's standing or seated, and what the operator's sanitation plans are for the space. And again, the last piece is the community feedback. So that's an overview of the form and how we got from the matrix, which is here just for reference in case people haven't seen it. This was the original matrix that was approved by the board a couple of years ago, and this got translated into that form. And then from here, based on the responses in that form, generally, if something receives a 1 or a 2 in that given section, that would be flagged in the form. If it receives a 4 or 5, there would generally be no concern. What we've been doing is using the response anchors themselves as the responses and just adding details as necessary. So, for example, you know, this is an example of a real application that was submitted back to DOT from us. We noted that this cafe had a large footprint, but it is acceptable because it received like 4 or 5 on this response. Similarly for the other sections, probably got 4 or 5, so it's just acceptable. And then the details here are just the response anchors. So that's our way of really trying to reply to these applications at scale, really only adding details where we feel are necessary. And in this case, the decision that came from it then was that it was an approval with modifications, just because, in this case, just because of the hours were outside of our typical hours for alcohol. In situations where we don't have that issue of the hours for the applications that we've done so far, we've been giving approvals. I don't think no application has received a denial so far. For the one application where we did receive significant community feedback, that application was then forwarded. We did not give a recommendation, and we forwarded that to the appropriate council member for further review. So that's the process so far. And for tonight, the goal is really to figure out, if we're comfortable with this process, if sort of that logic of leading from leading from the evaluation form to one of these three, or I should say four, potential recommendations makes sense, so that in the future, we don't need to have these applications go through the committee and full board in order to issue a recommendation. Instead, based on that logic, we'd be able to issue one of these four decisions and meet the deadline set by DOT, which is 30 or 40 days, depending on the type of application it is. So 1 second. Okay, so I believe that covers that. And then, we can move on to questions. So David, since you.
Two questions that may be pretty dumb, but one being, when did we decide on these hours? How did that come about?
So the rooftop and rear yard policy, I want to say is at least 10 years old. But it was meant to address, rooftops, like for liquor licenses. And in this case, because not every dining out establishment will be serving liquor, it's not always applicable, but for those that are, they would be subject to.
I mean, arguably, what, 98% of them are probably serving liquor?
No, a lot of them are bakeries. The ones we've received so far, actually, but.
That serve later. Okay, interesting. Okay, so that's just a long-standing policy for dining, for rooftop, okay? And has that been challenged in your tenure here?
No, the idea of all these policies is to establish, right, like a precedent so that it's fair across the board what the hours are gonna be. So it was determined at some point that, especially if a place is next to residences, that the hours should not really be going past, what is it, like 10 PM on the weekday and 11 PM on weekends.
Okay. Even though the law states it's an hour later for each, right?
So for a dining out, DOT's hours are until midnight.
Got it. Okay, and then the second question, and this might be a dumber question, is for these outdoor cafes, they're paying the city rent for use of the space? And how is that calculated?
I don't believe they're paying rent. I don't know if someone else has an answer for this, but I don't believe they're paying rent. I believe they're paying for the license.
Okay, I can speak to that issue.
Oh, sure. Todd, go ahead.
Okay, so the way this works is there's a combination of fees, licensing fees, and revocable consent fees that are set by the DOT and the city based on considerations of the value overall in the districts. And those are paid on an annual basis. And the idea is that compensates the city and the general public for the private use of public space, in this case, the cafes. There's been a lot of debate and controversy over whether or not those revocable consent fees and the licensing fees, are truly representative of, the value of that space. They're consistent across the boroughs. At one level, it makes no sense because certain neighborhoods, the value of the space and the outdoor cafes is way more than it would be at another place, but that was part of the package and the regulatory schema. It remains to be seen whether or not the fees are set at a reasonable rate such that they can afford to bankroll the the people at DOT and the administrative bureaucracy that's supposed to handle this. We'll have to see how that plays out.
Do you have an understanding of what the general, like, on a general basis, what those fees are for a typical space, like a 25-foot wide restaurant?
I got a head like a barn, but I believe it's in the neighborhood of 1,500 or 2,000 for the registration fee, and I believe that's done, on an annual basis. And then the revocable consent fee is somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 or 5. Don't quote me on this. I'd have to look in my notes. It's, substantially more. It's on a per square foot basis, but it's like $4,000 or $5,000,
For the
per year. Okay, so if you think about it, the value of space in New York, those are not unduly burdensome fees, but
Yeah,
that's
those are
the work.
really low, like ridiculously low.
Yes, well, the idea is that, and that has been the criticism. If you read the report, the open restaurants report that the task force put together, that was one of the big criticisms. The other thing is that the granting of these revocable consent and licensing fees and registration fees is a windfall for the landlords, because what happens is the landlords then simply raise the rent. So, the landlords are making out like bandits because they can now charge more for the storefronts. And, it's not the most, in my opinion, economically well thought out approach. But time will tell, and we'll do what we can.
Thanks, Todd.
Yeah, I mean, it's
Yeah.
an incredible land grab.
Yeah. Anyway, I want to get to.
I just have a question like you
Yeah.
said. So the revocable consent stays with the address, it's not with the business?
It should be with the licensee, I imagine.
I believe that's the
Revocable
case.
consent it goes to the license and the applicant. Right? So in other words, when you apply for the license and the applicant, that revocable consent is a legal agreement between the person applying for the license and the city. Right? So it runs with the license.
I just got confused when you were like, oh, the landlord raises the rent. I was just like, I guess they can say like, look, you have a location that's gonna get the approval, but on the same token, you can turn around and say like, I don't feel like applying, or,
Yeah, this is a little bit off topic. Yeah, sorry, trying to keep
No,
things tight,
no,
guys.
I think I mean, the idea of it is to
Like-
put some continued relief, like, you're not gonna, 2002 is still only 4 years away, right? So it's continued relief, and there is like,
Yeah,
it's nice to do, right? As someone that lives here, I like going and doing it. But like, it's not for the landlords to make an extra money and.
yeah. So I do want to, I do want to know, well, I would encourage us to have this conversation. It's, the details of the dining out program are set, and this conversation is not meant to
I
comment
was
on
just trying
the.
to understand.
No,
Yeah,
for
but
sure.
there's also.
Yeah,
I'd be happy, Janice is right, this is beyond the scope of our discussion tonight. If anybody would like to talk about the broader aspects of this, just buttonhole me, I'm happy to do it, separately.
Which is, wouldn't it be, I would say, like, wouldn't a consideration be if there was previous tenant, they moved out, previous tenant moved out, if we keep giving a license to the location and not, like, it's not keeping a business sustainable, it would be one of those things where it's like, this location hasn't worked. This is our 5th time voting on this location in the last 4 years. Wouldn't that be a consideration when you're looking at like, hey, this doesn't actually help the situation, it's not helping the business, it's kind of turning over.
So again, DOT gave us a form which requires us to, comment on each applicant in that specific location. On a case by case basis in a very like narrowly defined way. So you know, in terms of, again, it goes back to this form that you see here. They just want our comments on the physical footprint and dimensions, the pedestrian flow, and the existing curb use. You know, we comment on the hours because really it's either we're calling out the fact that the hours that they list in the application, which may or may not be accurate, don't align with their policy, or we want to call out the fact that to the applicant that, you know, when it's time for them to come to us for the liquor license, that it's likely we will be requesting hours consistent with our liquor policy for rooftop and rear yard spaces. So everything else is out of scope. It doesn't necessarily factor into the role that we play as a community board, which is really to understand how this cafe is going to sit within that neighborhood and any concerns that the community has about what is being proposed. Christopher.
So my question is, when can the chair just waive some of these things through? Like we have this with regular slap where I know that like
Mhm.
you don't see every single
Yeah,
application doesn't get to all of us. So like,
yeah,
there are lots of situations where the hours are just the hours and we just have one precedent. So what's the point in me going to a place to go physically tell them, oh, your hours are not in line with our strict precedent that I can't even talk to you about, right?
Mhm.
I understand like if there's a lot of community, if there are comments from the community, then yes, we have to go and liaise and like it's good for us to go there. But I think there are probably gonna be a lot of situations where the chair or like the chair plus, you know, the two of you that can just like do at a chair meeting, like wave a lot of these applications through. Does
Mhm.
that like, how does that affect like what we're looking at now? Like, is that just something that you'll decide based on what you see, or like, is that something that needs to be part of this process? Like, you know, if no comment from neighborhood, we will just slap our standard, you know, and provisos on it and send it off without sending anybody to do a site visit or convening any kind of meeting, because you can't have a meeting, nobody is there.
Yeah, so the order of what you said is a little bit switched. So for all of these applications, what we're trying to do is be as transparent as possible with the community, and that means noticing the community about each dining out application that we get. So going out, putting up notices, and then also doing our part of going to do a site visit and see if the plan that they've submitted with their application is accurate, because we've heard from other community boards that that's actually not the case. Like we were operating originally under the idea that DOT was checking these before sending it to us, but that it sounds like from the other community boards that that's not necessarily true. So, so the site visit does play an important part in this process, I would say, along with making sure that the notices go up so that the community has the opportunity to comment. And then from there, that's when we'll decide where to take it based on our evaluation of the space.
But then would it be reasonable to propose that we do the noticing part? And if like the comments don't come through, like to just skip the site visit?
No, because it's there, we don't know if the plan itself is representative of what's there. Because not everyone has like a professional architect drawing out plans for them. So it's not always representative of what's there. Todd?
Okay, I just want to say that I work with Janice. I was the chair of the Open Restaurants Task Force along with, you know, my stalwart group, and I totally support this. It's in the spirit and reflects the work that we did. And the fact, basically what's happened here is we've fine-tuned it so that it ties out, as Janice said, to the forms and the information the way DOT wants to see it. And big picture, if you look at it, it gives us a chance to comment on all of the things that the DOT and their bureaucratic mindset wants to know about and have on record. But, and this is the important thing for me, and I'd urge everybody to think about this, is that it allows us to comment on a holistic way on how any application impacts the neighborhood as a whole. And that is something that the DOT and their new bureaucracy and regulatory schema doesn't do so well. That's our job. And as all of us go out and do our due diligences by referring to the form and to the wonderful online questionnaire, which you can just fill out on your phone, it's streamlining our ability to perform that important task. So I wholeheartedly support this, and you know, and I hope that we can have a good discussion about this. If anybody wants to add anything to it, which to me it's reasonably complete, and this is our chance to make a recommendation to the full board and have them approve it.
Thanks, Todd. And before we jump into full discussion about this, I do want to give the public an opportunity to comment on this process if they wish. And similar to what I said to the committee, in regard to how DOT is approving these applications, we are not discussing, the pros and cons of the program tonight, but more how we as a community board, what our role is in this process and how we are getting to the recommendations that are possible to give. Wait, Catherine, do you have a question or a comment right now?
I have a question that could be I have questions, comments. I'm not, let's see. So the question is, I know we're not reviewing roadway cafe applications, but are those still relevant?
We are. Yeah.
We
this
are.
Is, yeah, sorry. I think the example I have up on the screen is sidewalk, but
Okay, so roadway applications are for a certain period, I think, till November, April to November. Is that what it is? Do they come under the same liquor? Will they also have to apply for a liquor license if they want to serve alcohol? The roadway applications?
yes, both roadway and sidewalk will
Okay.
need to apply for alteration.
My understanding, I just want to say this, my understanding is that it's a flat fee for a sidewalk cafe permit as well as a roadway permit, and that they can apply for both, and it's about a little over $1,000, and it's good for 4 years. And I think that's relevant because they'll come back to us because it should line up in terms of the SLA part of the, when we hear SLA applications, I just add that part.
Remember, Catherine, it's both the registration fee and the revocable consent fee. It's two
Right.
different.
But the license fee, so let me be a little more specific. The license fee is just over $1,000. That's my understanding, but we can, I guess the only question I had is, how do we handle that all sidewalks in New York are not built the same? Are we looking at the actual size of the sidewalk and the feet, or is that not relevant? And that's it.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And that's exactly why we do need to go out and visit the site, because it's not all sidewalks are the same width. So you might have two cafes that are exactly the same footprint, but one is located on a narrow corridor and then another one is located on a super wide avenue. So
avenues are usually like 100 feet, I think. And okay, maybe we could put some guidance in the form, so as people are going out, they can just kind of make notes about the how wide the street is and whatever else is going on.
yeah, DOT does have specific guidelines, I think, regarding
Okay.
how wide the cafe can be based on how wide the sidewalk is. But these are things that, might need to be more spelled out for our sake, because none of us are experts on what DOT's rules are for this program. But we'll have to take that as it comes, but it's definitely something to consider for sure. Thanks, Catherine. Okay, so back to the public. Steve, would you like to speak to the committee? Who's able to promote?
Hear me?
Yes.
Okay. How much time do I have?
We just ask that you keep it as succinct as possible. We won't time you since you're the only
Okay.
one who has raised your hand, so.
Oh, okay, no problem. And I really appreciate the thoroughness that CB5 has undertaken with these forms. So just briefly, my background is I just published a book on sidewalk cafes. I've been doing and designing sidewalk cafes for the last 30 years. I've executed and helped about 2,000 restaurants obtain their sidewalk cafe. And I also was the trigger for what referred to as the small sidewalk cafe in 2004. So the process by which you're going to run into issues where the drawings are not accurate or out of scale or disproportionate or don't have all the information. And primarily because DOT did not want an architect to have to be signed and sealed by an architect, which is not a problem at all, but the drawings are hand drawn sometimes. So you're going to run into that problem. And I've been on all the community board meetings so far, and I've seen it. So my concern is that there's not, and by the way, it's $1,050 for the registration or filing fee, what you might want to call. And there are 3 zones for square footage basis. And depending which zone you fall into, and there's a map, it'll tell you how many dollars per square foot you have to pay. And in my 30 years of doing this, there's only been one landlord who hit up on a restaurant who wanted a part of the whatever, you know. So landlords typically don't get into it, and so that's been my experience. Just so you know, I dropped off, and I will email your board a package that I created to help the city of New York obtain more revenue out of this program. The program is wonderful, is that it now allows you to have a sidewalk cafe in any residential zone, commercial zone, manufacturing zone, whereas before it was restricted. No residential zone could have it, so now they opened it up. And of course, they opened up the roadway, which allows restaurants to have more seating, with the negative aspect of it that it has to be removed November 1st and put back April for probably a cost of $40,000 to $50,000. You have to build it, disassemble it, and so on. So my package, I call it a package, will be delivered to you and by email so you can read it. But basically, the new regulations don't mimic the old DCA regulations. And so the width of the sidewalk, the pedestrian walkway, which used to be a flat 8 feet, or 50% of the sidewalk, has now grown to 10 feet and 12 feet, depending on which street you're on, which has effectively wiped out thousands of square feet that the city could gain fees on. So I don't want to, and of course the tree pit, it used to be that if you pave the tree pit or put a metal grating on it, you could walk on it, and the tree doesn't even count as an obstruction, but now you have to count the corner of the tree pit. So many of my clients have lost entire rows of seating, and a couple have entirely unable to even put seats outside, which is a shame. If I benefit, my firm, SWA Architecture, benefits in any way from this program, where I have to redo or do or whatever, I'm announcing or saying that I will dedicate 20% of that to cancer research.
Okay.
It's not
Thank
for
you.
me. Thank you. It's
Thank
not for
you.
me, but it's to help the city. So I'll leave it at that. I appreciate the time, by the way. And,
Thank you,
and
Steve.
I thank you so much.
Great. Is there anyone from the public who wants to comment on this topic? Okay, seeing none, we will go into business session, where the committee will discuss, how we're gonna go about this. Todd? Yep.
Commenting on something the gentleman said, which is an excellent.
Wait,
point.
hold on, Todd, we're having technical difficulties in the office.
My internet has been going out, internet really, I don't know if it's just.
Okay, can anybody hear me?
It's, yes,
Power go out.
Can I go?
I think the plug is behind you.
Okay, it sounds like the mic is still on, but well, and the cameras are on. It's just the monitor. Okay, so hold on one second. Sorry, everyone.
Yeah, it's, yeah, probably.
Okay, are we back?
Should be good now.
Todd, can you hear us?
Yes. Okay,
great.
just very quickly, the gentleman who was speaking in the public session makes an excellent point. I would simply say this, and this came up in discussion at the borough board. It's absolutely true. A feature, but not a bug of the program, is that they didn't want the applications to have to incur the cost of professional architects to submit to scale and detailed plans to keep the costs down. So that was a deliberate policy choice by the city council and, you know, the administration, and it passed. However, we as the community board that are doing the due diligence are left with, you know, short of, you know, making a site tour. It's so important that we do the site tour because we can't count on the material that's submitted in these packages to really know what's going on. One of the issues that came up at the borough board that I recently attended is there was a plan that we should probably make this point in our resolution that DOT they have plans, scale diagrams of all the sidewalks, maybe not with the side cafes on them, but what would be tremendously helpful to us when we go out and do our due diligence, and maybe put a link to it or include it in our due diligence material along with the forms, is the scale drawing that DOT has of the sidewalks with whatever was submitted, you know, the hand drawn or, you know, layperson's drawing superimposed on top of it. If we had that, when we, and that was, you know, one of our colleagues, I think it was on Community Board 1, Tammy, recommended that. But if we had something like that, when we go out to do our due diligence, the issue that was raised by the public, the person commenting on the public, would be, you know, we could address that issue and really, you know, focus our due diligence and give the kind of commentary that we need. That's something that we should talk about.
Thanks, Todd. Anyone else have thoughts about, yeah, Patrick?
Just about the thing of
Yeah, yeah,
the process in general. I super appreciate, I think that like, well, one, just kudos to the committee and leadership of this team for making it easy for us to process this. You've aligned it to DOT's form. You've made it a Google form, so it's easy for us to use. Like, that's that's incredibly helpful. I think the questions that I have are around, the ones that are aligned to DOT's form make a ton of sense. There are a couple that are the like CB5 more added ones, so like the questions like, will liquor be served in the outdoor cafe? What is the service style, seating or standing? And then what is the neighborhood appropriateness? I guess I'm curious the thinking on those ones in particular, like would we be less likely to approve one where there's drinking versus one where there's not? Would we be more likely to approve one where people are just sitting versus where people are standing? Like what was the thinking behind these? And I mean, my like subtext here is that I think the problems that we're worried about that are related to those are probably already covered in noise, flow, and some of the other things that DOT is already looking at. But I know that the committee put a lot of thought into this, so curious to hear y'all's input.
Yeah, for sure. That's a great question. In creating this form, it was really trying to take what was approved by the board and try to evolve it and stick to it as much as possible. Because we were hoping that that would have been sufficient for us to move forward and meet the deadlines without full board approval. Now that we've been told that we do need to reapprove whatever new process we come up with, we do have the opportunity to change things. So that is why some of the certain things got carried over that maybe we don't necessarily agree with anymore. And then at the same time, just general how we operate, like using liquor as the template, right, for how we are approaching this as well. That's where the method of operation questions come in. And I think now there's more clarity regarding how the liquor licenses will factor in. I think when this was created, they hadn't officially announced that the establishment would have to apply for an alteration to get the space license. So that was a concern that we didn't want, to go undetected. But again, given what we know now today as it stands, like let's talk about what we should be looking at.
Like, can I just clarify on that point? So before it was like, okay, we have these questions about liquor because we were like, oh, like if they don't have to apply again for an alteration, then are they going to be out of compliance with our rooftop and outdoor policy? But if they have to apply for an alteration, which they do, and we know that now, then we would see that in that direction and we might not have to consider it here.
Yeah.
Okay. I think that makes sense.
Yeah.
Just a general question around, I guess for lack of a better term, like closing the loop on this. So, a recommendation is made to allow this application to move forward, et cetera, the diligence has been done. Is there any responsibility by the board or elsewhere to just ensure like what you've applied for and what you've done is lining up and that there's nothing that's mismatched or something unusual or unexpected that happened? So I don't know if the board has a responsibility to just ensure like, hey, yeah, that lines up with exactly what you said you were going to do. So I'm just from a process standpoint, like who's doing that or where does that happen? Does that happen?
Yeah, so I think the way this has to work is that if we give a recommendation on an application, and Josh, feel free to correct me, but if we give any sort of recommendation that's not like a no comment, then the board will review it to see it. But at the very least, the whole purpose of tonight is to allow the deputization of like some smaller group, whoever the chair decides, to make a decision based on criteria that the full board would have voted on to arrive at that recommendation. So, in discussions that we've had, if something is totally controversial, just so, for the sake of speed, we might just issue a no comment, like similar to how we do for liquor licenses. And in that case, that wouldn't necessarily need to be reviewed by the rest of the board. But if we want to issue an approval or approval modifications or denial, then that would need to be reviewed by the full board. But at the very least, if we do vote to deputize a group, we could at least submit the recommendation to DOT by the timeline, by the deadline that they provide for the application. Josh, does that check out with our
Yeah,
discussions? Okay.
Yeah, I think what I was trying to get at is, if the application is indicating that there would be this length and width, or it will look this way, et cetera, and then based upon that criteria,
Mhm.
you know, whatever task force reviews and
Mhm.
says, okay, this looks good, this is an adherence, et cetera, great. And now, what makes sure that they're actually abiding by that?
Oh, that the applicant is abiding by it.
Yeah, the
So
applicant.
Technically DOT is supposed to
It's-
do it,
Okay,
yeah.
okay, yeah, and I guess I'm just trying to get at
Mhm.
if the community board has any responsibility to, you know, like,
Yeah.
oh, we'll look in 6 months and make sure that, like, oh, yes, this aligns with what we reviewed previously
Right.
or something like that,
Yeah.
and so,
I mean-
or is it out of the board's hands at that point?
Well, the thing is, it's like, if it is not in compliance in some way, the board like would potentially hear about it from the residents. So that's where we come in as a board, right? Like, we're here to field those concerns. And
Yeah.
then we would have to figure out what to do about it
Okay,
from
so
there.
if there's an issue, in theory, the board would get it back, but if it was just like some,
Yeah, like
minor-
say they're having parties every night in this outdoor space
Yeah,
and it's open till
that
like
that would
4
probably,
a.m.
yeah, totally makes sense, okay.
Then, theoretically, you would imagine the residents would complain to us, would file 301 complaints, and then it would become like a constituent services sort of matter.
Okay.
And we would handle it I imagine we would handle it similar to how we do for liquor licenses, where when the liquor license comes up for renewal, or speaking in regard to liquor licenses, when the license comes up for renewal, that's when we typically ask to try to renegotiate their affidavit, or at the very least, like, address the issue, like, work with the applicant to address the issue. To resolve, whatever's happening.
Okay.
So. Great. Any other comments?
I just wanted to quibble about the wording of one of the questions. The overall impact question uses overwhelmed neighborhood in both like the positive and the negative side of that question. So number one, the addition of cafe will overwhelm the neighborhood, or addition of cafe will not overwhelm the neighborhood. And then it goes on to give more specifics. I just feel like overwhelm the neighborhood could be removed entirely, just because it's a really kind of seems like a dramatic and subjective statement. It also seems like something that I could never do as a member of the committee, like walk into some situation, even if it were my own neighborhood, and decide whether 3 or 7 chairs in a cafe will change the neighborhood, whatever that, actually means. So I think that it's vague and dramatic and should just be removed. It should just say addition of cafe will make it more difficult to navigate, blah, 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 blah. Addition of cafe will not make it more navigate to the, so I've just proposed that as an amendment to the document.
Sure. Todd.
Just the general point, which is that our role is advisory. We have no power to enforce anything. However, what we do have the power to do is to register, as Janice said, is to register the feedback of the community if it comes to us, and on our own, acting under our mandate under the city charter, to advise, in this case, the Department of Transportation, right? So if they miss something and we see it, then we go on record by making these comments and putting it into the public record that this could be an issue, right? That has a certain, probative effect if things go wrong in the future. And, that goes to the issue of, what the advisory role of a community board is. So the more vigilant we are and the more reasonable we are, the bigger the impact our advice will have over time. As the person who drafted that overwhelming phrase, I think your point is well taken, and I have no problem seeing it removed. I think that my thought about putting it in originally was that the bureaucratic nature of the DOT and whoever it is reviewing this, I thought that being a little bit over the top in addressing some of these issues might add some color to it, but it's really just more rhetorical than it is substantive.
Great, thanks, Todd. Does anyone disagree with removing line, so it would say addition of cafe will make it more difficult to navigate, or sorry, will not. Okay, the one will say addition of cafe will make it more difficult to navigate and negatively alter its character, given width of sidewalk, street, and number of existing outdoor operations. The other end would say addition of cafe will not make it more difficult to navigate, nor negatively alter its character, etc. Any concerns about that?
I think the other items are very specific and like unambiguous, and overwhelm, I guess, could be interpreted in many different ways. And I don't think it detracts from the statement, so I don't see problems on my end.
Great. Okay, any other similar edits that people wanted to call out?
Can we just see it again?
Yeah, from the top.
Because for some reason I don't have access. So.
Oh,
yeah.
okay, yeah, well, we will fix that. Okay, so. Yeah, so again, under the effective shared use of sidewalk, street, it says footprint blocks or interferes with equitable use of these sidewalks / street by neighboring residences and businesses, right of way for pedestrians, vehicles, bicycles, etc., and or access to light and air.
No issues.
Okay. Regarding effect on pedestrian safety, cafe inhibits pedestrian visibility and their ability to navigate the sidewalk or street safely. Or it has little to no effect on it. Okay. Risk of crowding, high potential to attract crowds due to large footprint, proposed table and seating arrangement, past history of unruliness and civil discord, and or lack of crowd control plan. Versus a low potential to attract crowds due to reasonable footprint, proposed table and seating arrangement, and a past history of and or plan for effective crowd management.
When you're doing this, is there like, once again, I'm just trying to understand, do you get like, you know, the history, like, how would you know it? Like, is it part, like, do you get like something with the application there?
Yeah, we rely a lot on 301. Especially because like if we are going to pursue anything, that's typically what they
So
want to
we're
reference.
going by facts, right? Like, you're
Oh,
not
yeah,
saying like,
yeah.
oh man, it was so loud when I was walking by. That was what I
Well,
was
yeah,
trying to.
well, yeah, I mean, hopefully, we always tell residents, that's why we always emphasize to residents the importance of filing a 301 complaint, even though, you know, like it might take longer for the police to reply, or it might seem like the problem will persist. At the very least, they're creating a record, so that, you know, the necessary agencies to follow up. The board office also collects any comments that we receive, so that also, that anecdotal, also counts. But yeah, 311 is definitely, the go-to way of figuring out if something is problematic.
Oh, no, I was just, when I was reading through it before, I was just like. Yeah. You asking that, like you do?
Yeah, and I mean, typically it's like, at least for liquor licenses, if there's a problem, like, we know there's a problem. So. Okay, and then the overall impact, okay, we just talked about that one. So. We do note the number of outdoor cafes on the block currently. And then for existing curb use, the potential for conflicts with planters, bike racks, bike lanes, bus stops, parking, loading zones, etc. It, as a result, is likely to cause congestion given that existing curb use, or is not likely. Okay. And then is there, sorry, I'll just keep going through this. For the method of operation, so this was added in, but the noting that liquor will or will not be served in the outdoor cafe.
This is one that I have I guess, my overall like, disposition as somebody filling this out would be like, okay, each one, the ones that are on a scale of 1 to 5, it's like clear what to do, right? Like 5 is good, 1 is bad. This one, it's like, what's good or bad here? And also how is this going to affect the decision? And it seems like now that we actually know that it's gonna go through the SLA too, if we don't need this one. Like, I guess my overall disposition would be to only have questions in here that help us decide what to do next. And this one seems like an extra question that I would take out for like simplicity.
I mean, it's just, it's just like I would say like the seated and standing one too, like a 1 through 5 scale doesn't, like, I'm not gonna say, oh, it's a 2 seated or a 4 seated. It's either everyone's seated, standing, or mixed, right? Like, it's more of a.
But the question is like, is standing bad?
Yeah, like, yeah, I wouldn't say standing is bad necessarily, right? Like, like, it's a cafe, they have little tables, because actually sometimes standing will take up less room, right? It's a sidewalk cafe. They have little tables where you can sit and eat, like, that takes up less room than sitting, right? Like, there's pros and cons on each.
Yeah, I would say, the idea of the seating versus standing is like, at least the crowding. So it's this idea that if everyone is forced to be seated, right, there's less likelihood of people crowding. So it has less to do with the footprint, 'cause the footprint is the footprint, right?
Yeah, but but like,
Yeah.
just like you said, like, not all standings equal. Yeah, if it's like drinking outside, yeah, like, you get a lot of people standing.
Mhm,
But
yeah,
if it's like, there's like a cafe that has like, sometimes the cafes have the standing, and that actually takes up less room, right? Like, because, it's really for people to go with their dogs and have their bagel and drink coffee. That's like,
Mhm.
that's why it's just weird, the 1 to 5.
yeah,
Just do like 3 choices.
yeah, I hear you on the, like,
The
it's
same with the
either.
hours, right? Like,
Mhm.
you can fly or you don't.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, no, those are valid points. And then in regard to, I guess based on, does anyone have any thoughts on what was just said?
I think, well, I have one more, is
Yeah,
that if the issue that we have with standing is that it will cause crowding, we already have a question about crowding. I guess I think that all of the questions in the form should be about problems that help us make a decision about whether to approve or deny the application, and whether or not people are standing or whether or not liquor is being served is not a criterion for making a decision. The crowding is, the flow of it, of
Mhm.
people is, the safety is.
Yeah, I think it was a way to elucidate that further, right? Because it's like, okay, if you give it like a 1 in that, for that section regarding the crowding, it's sort of like, well, what is the why? Like, why did you do that?
Is that where additional notes comes in?
It could be, and maybe, I don't know, it's a way of like moving things around in this form so that it's more directly related to, because I hear your point about wanting every question to clearly lead to a recommendation. Todd, did you have a comment?
Yeah, yes. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
So I think the issue of seating and standing and whether or not liquor will be served, it is important to leave them in. I agree with the idea that whether or not the hours could certainly be a yes or no question. But it's not just the crowding and the issue of whether there will be a liquor license forthcoming, whether we know that when we render advisory opinion on the cafe itself is really very important, because there's a big difference between having like an ice cream parlor where you have 20 people sitting outside, how we view that, how that interacts with the rest of the neighborhood, and whether or not they might be serving alcohol out there, right? So, the presence of that question, I think, is critically important. The standing sitting is also important. Traditionally, if people are sitting, yes, they're less likely to be crowding, but it's also based on my experience dealing with liquor licenses, there's less likely to be rowdy behavior. People are sitting and eating their ice cream or drinking a beer. If they're sitting, it's just conducive to a more civilized environment. So, the presence of the questions, I think, is really important. The other thing to keep in mind is that unlike a liquor license, which comes up every 2 years, these cafes come up every 4 years. So we really have to have as much information as possible and not miss on our chance to comment.
Yeah, I think my recommendation for the seating is just to get rid of the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and to make it like the liquor license where it's just sitting, mixed, standing, right? What's a 2 standing or a 3 standing?
I think that makes sense. Okay, I mean, so I hear the concern about wanting it to be clear how each response is going to lead to a recommendation. So let me skip this section for now. Are there any other concerns about that process for the other sections? So this idea that if it's a one, if something gets a 1 or 2, that would be cause for concern to note in the form. And if it's a 4 or 5, it would say something like, yeah, it would say we're using the response anchor. So it would essentially say the positive response anchor if it's a 4 or 5, it would use the negative response anchor if it's a 1 or 2. And then there is a middle response anchor that I've been creating as it comes up, which is essentially just like a neutral version of what's here. With the additional detail as to why it's neutral.
I guess the music one is just yes or no, because like the rule is no music.
Mhm.
You know, so it seems like maybe like yes or no on music, but then maybe comments for like if they've had problems with noise in the past or something like that, you know, because we're gonna check as to whether or not and I don't know that that fits onto like a scale, like, you know, they've had X complaints, so I'm giving them a 2, but like they don't intend to have music, so. You know, so I feel like music is just, are they having music or are they?
Yeah, so you're suggesting like separating
I
out
feel
the
like
music.
Music, yes
and
or
the
no,
noise.
and then any
Yeah.
comment on noise violations.
Yeah, okay.
Cause I think at that point, the noise violations are just a qualitative
Mhm.
question.
Yeah,
I have a question
Yeah.
about this
Mhm.
hours of operation.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's so many restaurants that are open past 10.
Mhm.
And they serve alcohol.
Mhm.
And they have outdoor dining, so we would reject them?
so like before this whole program existed, as part of their affidavit, it would request that they stop serving alcohol after 10 p.m. Outdoors.
Okay, that seems unreasonable to me.
I agree.
Too
Okay.
earlier.
I
I
mean,
mean, I see so many restaurants with outdoor dining and they are open till 11.
mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, again, out of scope for today, in regard to the rooftop outdoor policy, but that policy was formed with the idea that, you know, especially again, if a place is near a residence, that they should follow, I assume like the noise code hours, which are 10 p.m. And stop outdoor service at that time. There have been instances where if something is not near a residence, that they are allowed to have later hours. And that's, you know, that's fine. But it's really
Okay.
just like when we get comments and concerns about people in an outdoor space where the sound is echoing and everything, that's why I assume it follows the noise code of cutting it off at 10 p.m.
Okay.
Yeah, Chris.
So, no, like this leads me to like an overarching question about like, we'll have the form, we'll send these things to the DOT. It's advisory, so they listen to us or they don't listen to
Mhm.
us. And I mean, at some point, we should say like, oh, DOT listens to us on these 10 or 12 things, like we should make sure we really actually catch them or not. But the DOT never listens to us on this other thing, so there should be a point at which, and I don't know when that point will be, we'll revise this again to say, hey, look, DOT doesn't care whether we say 10 o'clock or 12 o'clock on
Yeah.
whatever, sitting or standing, I don't know, whatever it is. But like, where does that fit into this process? Like, when will
Yeah.
we look at this again to say what the DOT actually cares about, and what it doesn't?
Yeah, I think that's a great point to add. And it's something, so I think as a result, because we are voting on this tonight, we do need to write up a resolution. So as part of the resolution, that could be one of the whereases, which is like, we will look up, we will revisit this matrix, like, I don't know what a reasonable time line would be, in order to reassess, as necessary. I don't know what, I'm not sure, I guess the other policies that we have call for like yearly. I'm not sure.
I'm just thinking about the
Mhm.
timeline is that like, because the one that I just looked at the other day, they were like, oh, we won't even have a chance to put this up until spring.
Mhm.
So, you know, whatever we do, DOT was gonna do whatever it does, but no data about how people care about it or not is gonna come for more than like, you know, 4 or 6 months from
Mhm.
now, before that even starts. So whatever that point is, it might need to be a little bit longer in this first period, because we don't like. The November deadline for all is coming up, and then there won't be any roadway cafes potentially. you know, until April of next year. So
Mhm.
whatever that timeline is, I don't know, like a year, I have no idea.
Yeah, so you would propose,
little
we
bit.
look at this, every, like, once a year situation? Okay. Does anyone have concerns about that? No. Okay. Okay, so. Yes, and no one else had concerns about the idea of, you know, if it's one or two, it gets flagged, for. There's also a second part to this, where it gets, yeah, so it gets flagged, or it's a 4 or 5, it gets the positive. In terms of how we arrive at these potential recommendations, so we have the option again to waive review, we have the option to approve the application, approve with modifications, or issue a denial. As I was saying earlier, we discussed how, you know, if we want to streamline things, if something, say, is acceptable across the board, that instead of issuing approval, it's just a waive review. And then, if there is something that is of concern, then that becomes an approval with modifications. And then we can discuss what a denial would be, since that hasn't come up yet.
In theory, those approval with modifications might come out of, let's say, comments in the form or something like that, right? Or like if we're allowing for like a 1 or 2 to be flagged, you might want to know, well, why is it being flagged, or what is the reason for that? And I would imagine that would directly come into play if we're making a approval, but with, you know, these stipulations or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, that could be something we quickly think about, which is just like, what are the modifications that we would ask for, either based on, yeah, the responses to the form or potentially community feedback. I think something that's come up already with the one controversial application that we had was, actually, I'm not even, I don't, like, we didn't have a community meeting yet, so I'm not even sure.
It was a really busy area. There was
Mhm.
like, it was the restaurant that wanted the outdoor dining was in a hotel. And so if it's a hotel, you know, they've already got bell people walking in and out. They've got taxis right there. Biden stayed at that hotel. So like there were police, barriers everywhere. And they're like, oh, we're gonna put, you know, like 12 little tables right over here. And everyone like living next door was like, I will not be able to get to my apartment. I already can't get to my apartment. Like the congestion is already super intense. And so it was like, you know, stipulation that the applicant was really amenable to was like, you know, if the president's in town and there's already a bunch of barriers up, don't put the outdoor dining out that day. And they're like, yeah, we like probably wouldn't do that anyway, like not good for our business. Or like holidays were another thing, like, you know, Thanksgiving or Christmas, it's already super congested. So they were like, yeah, cool. Like if they're like, we could put in we could put in writing that we will, if we have advance notice or we know that there's gonna be days where there's a lot of congestion, we won't do outdoor dining.
You don't track if they also, could you, I just thought of it when you were saying that, like if they put out like additional heating or something like that, like it's just not something.
We're not an enforcement agency. DOT is actually not.
No, but it can kind of go to crowding, right? Like if they're like, oh, they have heat lamps, it's
Yeah.
kind of, it's a crowding thing, right?
Mhm,
That's
yeah.
like, it's additional crowding. It's not, for me, that's why I was just like, an additional note, hey, they have heat lamps. This might add to crowding just because, you know,
Mhm.
it does, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so that
We're
was
not
something
saying,
that
hey, you
we
can't
know.
have heat lamps or not, but it's something you should probably note, right? Like, oh, they have
Yeah, I
like,
mean, if
or,
they even know what they're doing, right, at this
Correct.
point. Todd?
Yeah, hi. So, I agree with all of these sentiments. The only thing I want to say is the idea that, you know, we should review what the DOT ignores and, you know, stop asking those questions. I think that we have our own mandate, and what we say and the DOT ignores is not necessarily the last word on this, right? So if we consistently make a point about some aspect of the license or the application and they ignore us, right? And we look across our district and even with our other community boards, and we see that they're being ignored across the board, and we're seeing the feedback, that's no reason for us to stop commenting on it. That's just us exercising our independent function on advice. And we have to hope that over time, they'll see the benefit of listening to us, or the elected officials will see it and act on it and maybe change the law or put the heat on the regulatory agency. So, I think we should consider that.
Thanks, Todd. Okay, I do want to wrap up this conversation because it's almost 7:30. We still have just a quick update after this. So I think maybe it helps to work backwards. So essentially getting to each of the recommendations, what would ultimately lead to those. So the idea of, again, this idea of potentially streamlining things by not issuing approvals, but like for cafe setups that are totally non-controversial, they got acceptable across the board and we didn't hear any community comment. Instead of issuing an approval for those, we would say no comment and waive review. So approval would not really be an option. Like a straight approval would not be an option. Instead, it's just waive review. Does anyone have any issues with that? Okay, so that will exist as one option. And then for a denial, can people think of any situation where we would issue a denial as opposed to an approval with modification?
I guess if there are a lot of ones and the applicant is not willing to negotiate.
Okay. We have this weird also situation where for sidewalk cafes, I think there's this like checkbox here that where they have the applicant acknowledge, there's a checkbox that says applicant acknowledges but does not agree with the modifications.
Okay.
So, but that doesn't exist for roadway application. So that said, yes, Miles, if you have a question.
I guess another scenario where we would just straight deny is if we had a bad actor applicant, who just
Okay.
has a history of complaints, and I think we've seen that before in the liquor license,
Mhm.
yeah.
When you, sorry.
1 second, Todd, hold on. Yeah.
Yeah, when you say like a bad actor, are you talking about like the establishment itself has had a history, or like the proprietor or owner has a reputation, or all of the above?
Yeah, it could be either, like
Okay.
we've had situations where the establishment has a history of problems. And then we've also had situations where an applicant specifically, we follow them around.
Got it.
Has a history of problems.
Okay, and then do we still want to have a situation where if we do request modifications, but the applicant is just totally unwilling to cooperate? That would be a denial?
Yes, could I make
Oh,
my
yeah,
comment?
Todd, sorry, yeah.
Okay, so we should absolutely have the ability to have a straightforward denial. And that's consistent with what we do with liquor licenses. But the norm for our committees over the years is that we use it rarely. It's only for the bad actors, or where we have a non-cooperative applicant. If we sum up all in totality, all of the feedback and information we got from our due diligence, and we say, you know what, taken together, there's no way we can approve this, and if we then, normally the norm is we would go back to the applicant and say, listen, we can't approve this the way it is, right? Unless you approve, make some modifications, have fewer chairs and make the footprint smaller, that there's going to be an outright denial for what it's worth, right? It's important that we have that option and use it rarely. And, if we're consistent and fair, it'll carry some weight, I hope, over time with the DOT. And that's what happened with the liquor licenses. We built up a reputation, and the denial means something, even if rarely used.
Yeah, I think that is a great point to note that we do rarely issue denials for liquor licenses. So similarly, I imagine we would not be issuing denials very often for dining out applications. Okay, so now moving to the slightly more ambiguous area. Approval with modifications. What situation might trigger that decision?
I think the hours, sorry, hours is probably gonna be number one, especially since DOT says till midnight and we have
Mhm.
other ideas about that. So, we could say approval, but if you would just put your hours in, fine, that's probably one of those.
Great.
I think any situation where there's an affidavit that we're like, oh, you said you wanted to put 5 heaters and 10 plants over here, but that clearly doesn't fit, like, if you just write an affidavit that you're not gonna do that anymore. Right,
Yeah, or where you're installing 5 TV things, can you make sure that it doesn't like outlay with the entrance in so people don't come and surround the entrance or something, because that could clog up the sidewalk, or just making note of that, right? Like, hey, we prefer you offset, like, we can't tell them to offset it, but it's like, hey, just know if you put this right here, people are gonna clog your entrance, which is gonna hurt your service as well. Common sense stuff, like, I think people know.
Yeah, Sachi, using the example that you gave before, so in a situation where the cafe was in compliance, it was only like, 4 feet wide or something like that, but it's just like depending on, right?
but that
the-
context was super,
Right.
yeah, congested.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so in that case, like, how do you think that would have?
Like they were willing to put into writing that this is what they'd be willing to do. And I think the other line that's really helpful in our liquor license affidavits is like, here's the number of a person you can call. And like that goes a long way with neighbors as well. So anytime that we do an affidavit would be like an approval with, well, yeah, an approval with this.
Yeah, so it's kind of like, yeah, so I guess that would stem from the community comment section, right? Because we got concerns and that was sort of like the way of addressing it. That would be considered a modification that we would note. So anything that comes out of conversations, those would be listed as modifications. In this situation, for example, we did note to DOT that it had a large footprint, but it was acceptable. And this wasn't the reason why it got an approval with modifications, but for example, in this situation, like ignoring the hours for a second, would this have been a straight, well, like a no comment versus an approval with modifications? I guess if we didn't get feedback on this application.
So
Or-
the main problem was the footprint.
Yeah, so I guess, or what, let me rephrase that. So if something receives like a middling rating, how would that factor in? Would that then lead to a no comment, or would that need to be listed as like something we would want to modify?
I think it's something we'd want to modify,
Okay,
is my take.
okay. Okay, so
Because
essentially.
If we're not giving any comment, then DOT isn't like benefiting from the expertise that our staff and
Mhm.
volunteers are bringing
Mhm.
in having gathered a bunch of comments or in having like visited the place. At least if we're putting, yeah, I guess a no comment takes us out of the picture, and if we're saying there should be modifications, then we're bringing our local expertise.
Okay. Okay, so from what it sounds like, it's something would only be waived, the review would only be waived if it's like totally non-controversial, there's no concerns across the board. Anything else would imply that there's some modification we want to make, and therefore that's an approval with modifications. Does that check out?
So then like, so number 3 in something like potential conflicts with planters, blah, 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 blah,
Mhm.
blah.
Yeah,
Like, what does that mean? And how do you say like, it neither conflicts with planters nor doesn't conflict with planters, or like there are no planters there anyway, so that's a 3. Like, So I think like some of these threes should just be neutral and would then result in waiving comment, because it doesn't, it's not like you're making any statement about planters at all. You're just saying, I have nothing to say about planters, as opposed to 5, oh, they have a great plan for their planter, you know,
Like there are no planters.
right, like, what is the neutral, what does the neutral number mean
Mhm.
on those? And then when is it okay? I mean, like, we did eliminate a lot of situations just now where like having a neutral number makes no sense.
Mhm.
So now that we have situations where a neutral number maybe makes sense, the neutral number, what does it mean? Does it mean just don't worry about it? Or does it mean, yeah, we have to, there's no plan, so we want them to come up with a plan for the planters?
Mhm.
I think that would probably be up to the individual doing the, like, if you go, you talk to the applicant and you're like, oh yeah, everything looks good. This problem with the planters is like not terrible, you know, it technically doesn't really fit our specs, but actually like it doesn't really, I don't know, it's gonna be fine because of the way that they're doing it and because of the way this corner looks and because of who, and because it's just a bakery or whatever, you know, like you, I'd be fine leaving that up to discretion of the members.
Okay.
Like how, if everything's like, I guess is the situation you're coming down on them is like, everything's a 5 except for this one is a 3. No.
I'm just saying, what does 3 mean?
I guess it's like, well, maybe it just goes back to the idea that if we have a modification to suggest, then it's approval of modifications. If there is nothing to be done about it, then it's just no comment. Does that sound right to people?
Yes.
Okay.
But then I guess like just the
Yeah.
criteria, like, the trigger doesn't need to be like the number, like if number 3 doesn't have to be, you know.
Yeah, so it's more like, it's just if there is something to be done about something,
Then it-
that would be listed as a modification and that would become an approval with modifications versus a no comment. But if there's like nothing really wrong, like maybe one thing isn't great, but there's nothing to be done about it, like, yeah, can't move like the tree. Or whatnot, that would just be a no comment. Todd.
Yeah, again, I'm trying to follow this comment. I totally agree with everything that's been said. The only thing I have to add is thinking about the kind of modifications we might ask for. You know, hours, which would come up at the liquor license review, or the size of the footprint. So for example, I just did a due diligence where there's one of those kiosks, you know, literally right in the middle of the sidewalk that is absolutely a hazard and reduces people to walking single file, but somehow, you know, was approved by the DOT. You know, it's literally just barely within, you know, the right size, but on a narrow sidewalk, it's absolutely intimidating. So for something like that, right, looking at, even though everything else related to the license is fine, it's just so stark that unless they agreed to, you know, change, just give some more clearance at one end of their proposed cafe, we would have to reject it. And if the DOT ignored us, I mean, looking at it, it's obvious that all the people that live in the block are going crazy. And even the applicant was going crazy for that very reason. But you know, those are the sort of situations where, you know, we would have a rejection, or we would hope that, you know, putting the comment in and getting the applicant to agree is going to lead to a mutually beneficial process for everybody.
Thanks, Todd. Yeah, for that example, I imagine if something, like if the clearance really wasn't appropriate, we would probably note that as like a negative. We'd probably give the negative response anchor and then suggest the modification, like, okay, you have to like leave a gap there in your outdoor cafe to allow for the clearance or something. So I think that would still follow the logic that we've created, where as long as there's some modification that can be made, it would become an approval with modifications, unless of course unless the applicant is just totally non-cooperative, in which case that would lead to a denial. Does that make sense?
Agreed.
Great. Okay, so I think we have what we need to get to each of these 4 points. or I guess like technically three potential recommendations, either to waive review, submit approval with modifications, or denial. There were some changes with the form specifically that we wanted to make, I guess, in regard to the method of operation section. Let's see. We wanted to make the option more binary, whether it conforms to the hours or it doesn't. Same with music, it does or doesn't. Service style might become part of the crowding question. Noise, I think would just be a separate question under the section. But that would remain a scale, I believe. And then sanitation and cleaning is also on a scale that remains the same. Okay, any other changes we want to make to this form? Okay, and is it clear how these things would then factor into our recommendation? How each of these questions would factor into our recommendation? Okay, great. So does someone want to try to summarize that, make a motion? So that we can deputize.
I'll make a move.
Okay, go for it, Todd.
Okay, I move that the form, as put forth and discussed at our meeting, be adopted with the changes as discussed, and submitted for full board approval. I guess I need a second.
Second.
Okay, great.
Okay, so just to be clear, this motion, we're just focusing on the changes to the form. We're not talking about the deputizing or how that informs your options.
So, yeah, wait, let's think about this. Okay, so the form is
We
adopted.
can do this motion first.
No, I think it's better. Is it better than one motion?
Yeah, whatever you want.
Right, it's the same resolution. Okay, so then form is adopted as discussed. That's the first motion, and then another motion to let's see.
It's not like each motion needs its own resolution, right?
No, that's what I was asking, because like in that
Yeah, I
case,
didn't think
it should be
so.
one motion. I mean, essentially what needs to happen is like based on the changes we're making to the form then flows into a recommendation that will become the recommendation of the full board.
Yeah, I feel like we didn't talk about like one of the core issues here, which is that if we want to make comments on these applications within the time frame we're given, then we need to deputize essentially Janice and I to fill out these forms and submit them without getting full approval from the board, because we don't have enough time to get full approval. So we need somebody to motion that.
Motion to let the chair and vice chair complete the form and submit it using the information gathered.
yes.
For everybody else.
That's a second motion, it's a second motion with a rationale, which is that given the realities of the timetables, that the chair and vice chair have discretion to submit the forms, to fulfill our advisory duty, without the full board deputizes or grants authority to the chair and vice chair to act on these submissions.
Yeah, just so everyone feels comfort with that. So this is what CB2 is doing, just so they can like rapidly respond. We didn't just come up with this out of nowhere.
That's exactly what I was going to say, to be able to say that this is consistent with what other boards are likely doing, given the time constraints and windows, and the breadth of fullness by which we're looking at the application. But the other boards are doing this.
For those to be like, whereas. Thanks for has done this before.
Yeah, we can also say that. Whereas, what CB2, I think there's a few boards that are doing this, but I'm not sure, Josh would know. But yeah. Okay, think we got it. Is there a second?
Second,
Great. Okay, let's take it to a vote.
okay. Christopher,
Yes.
Dave Shapiro,
That's,
Janice,
Yes.
Catherine Ellington,
Yes,
Elon,
Yes.
yes, Sachi,
Yes.
Tom,
Yes.
Todd Shapiro,
Yes,
and Yoder.
Yes.
Passes.
Great, okay, so second item on the agenda, so I'll give this update since Ron is out, but essentially the RLA task force has been kicked off with the purpose of improving quality of life issues in the RLA while also balancing commercial interests in the area. The task force's goals are to, one, understand the issues and tension points between nightlife operators and residents in the area. Two, help implement potential remedies that can improve quality of life issues in the area. And three, revise the RLA document to better serve the neighborhood. Again, the task force is led by Uranodi Victor and has two subgroups within it. One focused on collecting quantitative data in the area consisting of, and this group consists of Samir Lavinia and Zona Chu. And the other group will collect anecdotal data, and ongoing feedback from the residents and the business operators. And that group consists of Christopher Nazaro and Yonan Tondon. And Libby Hutton will also be assisting. So this is a continuation of the work Iran has been doing in collaboration with the board office and the area stakeholders, and is really just a recognition of the resources and personnel we will be dedicating to this issue. Are there any questions or comments?
So the update is that it exists.
Yeah, so it's been kicked off. There are two groups looking at data, trying to bring everyone together, make sure that the meetings that are happening between the block association that is formed and the nightlife operators continues. So that we can try to get to those resolutions, which will hopefully be incorporated into the revised RLA policy. Cool. Yeah, any questions or comments from the public? I see we have one member online. Thank you for staying with us. Okay, seeing none then, that concludes our agenda and we are adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
thank you.
Next time.
We'll,
Good seeing you.
can someone shut off the Zoom?
Strict plan before I was even named to the board. This week was fine. But I'll be in Vegas. So. Nice. So, all right, sorry.
Sorry.